In the previous videos, we looked at arrays where we knew exactly how big we wanted the array to be. We knew it wanted to be a certain number of columns or a certain number of rows, and we could build that very easily into the VBA code. However, there are situations where you don't know exactly what the user is going to give you. For example, if we think about the sum function, right? The sum function never knows what the user is going to give it. It could select these first four numbers, or it could select the entire array there. Because the sum function doesn't know, it needs a way to figure out how many rows and how many columns is the array that I was just given. So that's what we're going to learn in this video, is how to use the ubound function to take a variable sized array from the user and figure out how many rows and how many columns it has. There are going to be a few things we need to learn first about working with user input arrays in VBA. So let's flip over to our VBA code and look at that right away. Notice that we start with our option explicit. We're always going to start with that to make sure we initiate our variables properly. Now we're going to start out with a function, and let's call this function numRows, because we want to know how many rows does the array that the user just gave to me have in it. So we're going to say input array is going to be what the user gave us, and we're going to define this as a variant. All right? A variant is going to be a data type that allows for arrays. All right? So this is the data type we're going to use when we don't know exactly what it is that the user is going to be giving us. All right, we've created our function. Let's create our output. numRows, we're going to set that equal to 1, just a dummy variable or a dummy value for now. We'll replace that before we're done. Now, the first thing you have to know about working with arrays that are dynamic in size is that VBA needs to know that it's an array. This is not going to make a lot of sense, and we're not going to go to the depth of the computer science behind this. But what we're going to have to do whenever we take a variable that's a variant, right, an array that can be multiple sizes, is we're just going to have to come into Excel, into VBA rather, and type input array equals input array. Whatever the name of this variable is, we need to restate that it is equal to itself, which seems very silly. All right? But this is important basically from a computer programming perspective to let Excel know that it's an array. There are other things it could be. Again, we're not going to go into that depth, but at this stage, we just need to know we have to have this line in here to make this program work. All right, so that's going to be an important thing. If you don't do this, you're probably going to end up with something like a value error. All right, so we can put a comment in here, have to set input variable equal to itself. All right, we're always going to have to do that working with our user-defined input arrays. All right, the next step then is how to figure out how big this thing is. That's what we're really interested in. How many rows does our input array have? So we're going to determine number of rows. And we're going to fix our typing as well as we go. There we go. Determine number of rows. This is where the ubound function comes in. All right, ubound is the function. And here we actually have to take that. We're going to set that numRows equal to our ubound function. Now, ubound takes two arguments. The first argument or input to it is going to be some array. In this case, input array is what the user gave us. Now, the second argument is going to specify whether you want the number of the size of the array in the first dimension or in the second dimension. All right, we've spent a lot of time in the last videos talking about rows and columns. So which one of those is the first dimension? Well, it's rows. Rows always comes first. So if you put a 1 in as this second argument, that means you want to know how many rows does that array have. If you put in a 2, that means you want columns. It's kind of confusing here because you're always putting this in as the second argument to the ubound function. You're just using either a 1 to tell it rows or a 2 to tell it columns. In this case, we want rows, so let's give it a 1. So let's go back to our VBA and see how this is working. Sorry, back to our Excel. So as we come back over here, we see numRows. We hit F2 to refresh that thing. And if I have selected that array, we see that it has 4 rows in it. Now let's actually change our input up a little bit. Let's, instead of doing that, let's select, sorry about that. let's select this second array. So our second array here, we select that whole set. We should see that it has 3 rows, right? 3 rows of data. There we get 3 rows. Alternatively, we could select both arrays, right? Notice there's nothing about whether there's anything in it that matters, right? In this case, we have 8 rows, and so the number of rows should give us an 8. Right? And again, we could pick any array that we want here. We could pick, something over here that has 17 rows. No data in there, but it does have 17 rows, and we get the number 17 back out. All right, so that gave us the number of rows. Like I said, if we use the 2 as that second argument, that'll give us the number of columns. So let's build a second function that does that for us. So let's come back over here. We're going to just take our function, copy it, and let's call this numColumns. All right, so we're just flipping how this thing works. Input array is variant, going to be the same. Still have to have input array equal to input array, so that's okay. Now we're going to determine the number of columns, and the only thing that we have to change is instead of a 1, now we have a 2. And that tells us we want the second dimension of this array, right? Because the first dimension is the number of rows. The second dimension are the number of columns. So how many columns do we have here? So as we go back to our model then, if we come back in here, we see a name error because I didn't have the function written yet. Now it should recognize that the function is there. If we look for the number of columns here, we should see 2. And that's what we get. If instead, let's select that many. So we added 6 more, so now we have 8 total columns. Now we get 8 total columns as the feedback that we get back. So that U-bound is really going to allow us to figure out how big is the array that the user is given to us. That way we can then use our techniques like looping to do something over each element of that array.